I'd like to continue with our discussion of British painting by talking about the two leading portraitists of the latter part of the 18th century. These are Thomas Gainsborough, who I'll talk about first, and then Sir Joshua Reynolds. As I mentioned last time, portraiture and Protestantism seem to go together very well, partly because there's a huge market for portraits, human vanity being a universal value. Anyway, people always wanted to have their portraits painted, so there's this constant, steady market for it. And this is particularly true in Britain, where you have a burgeoning middle class enriched by industrial activities, by the slave trade, by colonial enterprise, and those sorts of things. So vanity, paired with rising social expectations with sufficient money, resulted in one of the great flowerings of portraiture in the last half of the 18th century. Society portraiture, which is what I'd like to talk about with Gainsborough, society portraiture is again another subgenre of portraiture in which people are shown not so much as individualized portraits, but as icons of class and wealth. And we see a very good example of that with this picture. This is the portrait of Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett. Its nickname is the Morning Walk, and if you want to remember just the Morning Walk, that's fine, because that's what a lot of people call it. And it was painted in 1785. Gainsborough was one of those British artists who never, or English in this context, who never left England. He never went to France, never went to Italy, never even went to Scotland. I mean, he just basically was sort of a homebody. He was an autodidact, that is, that he was largely self-trained. He was helped as a young provincial artist in Ipswich, a little village a couple hours north of London, where he initiated his practice. He had some minor, sort of instruction and help, but he largely learned how to paint himself. He was completely uninterested in the sorts of aesthetic theory and hierarchy of genres and that sort of thing that really sort of floated Joshua Reynolds' boat. And although they're almost exact contemporaries, it would be harder to imagine two artists coming at the same profession, that is largely portrait painting, from such completely different backgrounds and with such completely different expectations. The Morning Walk, then, is a specimen of society portraiture, shows a recently married couple strolling through a completely imaginary landscape. This is kind of fairyland. It's not intended to be a particular place. But the fact that they are located out of doors shows the connection between aristocratic rank and the possession of land. One of the great problems of this rising middle class, I hate that term, but it is kind of what it is, the rising and very rich middle class in later 18th century Britain, is the fact that their social aspirations were towards aristocratic rank. They were trying to get titles. They wanted, if you made a huge fortune, you wanted to marry at least one of your children into an aristocratic family. The way this normally worked is that a rich industrialist or a rich merchant or something like that would provide a very large dowry for one of his daughters so that she could marry the son of a relatively impoverished aristocrat. It's one of these completely pragmatic solutions in the great English way of marrying rank with money. What this produced was sort of a new hybrid class and encouraged more and more of these rich middle class people to try to either marry into the aristocracy or figure out some way to attain social rank. As soon as someone, a middle class person, made a fortune through, as they called it, trade, that is anything that dealt with money changing hands, they immediately, when they became rich enough, they stopped that and bought a country house, or built one usually, and then started living like a country gentleman, because land is what gives rank. The only respectable occupation for an aristocrat that made money was to have tenants farm land and live on their rents. In other words, what the land could provide in terms of a source of wealth or an economic commodity, that's all right. But any suggestion that a person of rank, an aristocrat, is indulging in trade or commerce or something like that was socially degrading. And those few who did it very much on the quiet, and they worked through agents rather than out in the open. The Halletts are middle-class people, but they're represented with this sense of insouciant ease and grace and wealth that one associates with traditional forms of aristocratic culture. If you think back to Antony van Dyck's picture of Charles I at the Hunt, which we saw a while back, it has that same sort of elite, almost a sort of self-satisfied look to it that presupposes that the spectator, the viewer of the picture, is going to believe in their rank and in their social superiority. I suspect that you would not recognize either one of these people were they to walk into the room. It's sort of the opposite of portraitists like Velázquez, who we talked about a while back as well, who's very interested in the naturalistic reproduction of physical features. This is exactly the opposite. Society portraiture then employs the sort of the tools of social rank glorification. It makes middle-class people look upper-class. It makes ugly people look like glambots. It sort of aggrandizes them in every particular way. When you see the landscape itself, even though it is completely confectionery, Gainsborough is a master of landscape, and that's what he really liked to paint more than portraits. There's a kind of a feathery application of the brushwork that's quite sort of subtle and evocative. For instance, if you were to look in some of the details of areas like this or like this, you would, if they just in the detail, you would be hard pressed to identify natural form. They look almost abstract because the brushwork is applied in such a very loose and evocative way. And I'll point out one more thing. If you see her tiny little tootsie emerging from the bottom of her hem, you begin to understand foot fetishism, which is one of the great sort of erotic interests of the 18th century, and we saw that in Fragonard's Swing just a while back. This is Gainsborough's portrait of one of the most remarkable women of the era. It's the portrait of Sarah Kimball Siddons, and it dates 1785. Sarah Kimball Siddons was a very famous London stage actress, and she was a member of an acting dynasty. The Kimball family, two brothers, father, and one nephew, were major players on the London stage. Sarah Siddons was sort of the premier actress of the day. I don't know who you would even call that now. Helen Mirren or somebody like that. Anyway, she played all sorts of roles: comedy, history, tragedy. She played Shakespeare, she played farce, restoration comedy. She could really do absolutely everything. Gainsborough's portrait of her here, though, does not even allude to her profession as an actress. He shows her as a lady of society. She is shown very elegantly dressed. She was rich from her profession. I should say, too, that she's probably the first female stage actress who attained this kind of rank and wealth and, sort of celebrity without the tinge of prostitution or shady reputation that often accompanied women who went on the stage in the 18th century. She sort of broke that barrier and became a true professional at a time when it was very difficult for women to achieve that level of distinction in that field. She's shown here in a day dress. This looks incredibly elegant and rich to us, but this is the kind of thing you would wear in daytime, seeing friends or going shopping or something like that. She's sort of caressing this absolutely beautiful fur muff that help keep her hands warm and all of that. She's wearing a black felt hat studded with dyed ostrich feathers. These are incredibly expensive things in the 18th century. She's seated and turned in a slight profile. This is called by the French term profil perdu, that is a lost profile, not a pure one, but a halfway type of profile. And again, there's absolutely no reference to her profession. When Gainsborough painted this, he did it on speculation, and this is an important thing because we're going to see in just a minute that Joshua Reynolds does the same thing with Mrs. Siddons, but it's a completely different conception of what a portrait like this should look like. Anyway, as a society portrait, which is what we're dealing with here with Gainsborough's portrait of Mrs. Siddons, he went to her and asked her if he could paint her portrait, because he understood, and he said, I'll give you the painting for free, Because what Gainsborough and other artists also, and Sarah Siddons too, also understood that celebrity of the type that she enjoyed was a gold mine. It was a gold mine in the fact that this image was mass reproduced in a whole bunch of media. Gainsborough, of course, is looking for the print market, engravings after his painting that then could sell to people who could not afford a one-off oil-on-canvas type of picture. These kinds of images, Gainsborough's and Reynolds too, as we will see, begin to appear on the top of cookie tins, biscuit tins, snuff boxes, just throughout visual culture, on fans, ladies' fans and stuff. The image would be replicated in that way. Whoever then held copyright for the image itself, which Gainsborough would want to retain, and Siddons understood that, would be very, very marketable. The reason why is not just money, though. Gainsborough and Reynolds both were members of a very important art society that was founded in 1768, fairly recently, within both of their lifetimes. This was called the Royal Academy of Arts. Again, founded in 1768, and it was established, the royal part of it, by King George III. He was the one who went mad later in life. You may have seen that movie, The Madness of King George. He became king in 1760, and he died insane in 1820. George III was the first of his dynasty, which was initiated in 1714, who actually spoke English and had been born in England. George I and George II were Germans and spoke only German. George II spoke a little English. But many people thought of them, the Hanoverians, that's their dynasty, thought of them as foreigners. That's why the Jacobites back at Culloden and all that were so upset. These are the people they wanted to throw out because they didn't really think they were British. But George III was thoroughly British. Spoke English without a German accent. Again, his whole cultural orientation was England rather than Hanover in Germany, which is where the family actually came from. Anyway, George III was very interested in art, unlike George I and George II, who wouldn't know, a painting from a petunia. Completely ignorant in terms of art and uninterested. They saw it as an idle type of luxury. They'd much rather buy, battleships and things like that. Anyway, George III in 1768 chartered the Royal Academy of Art. 1768. When you think about the fact that the Académie Royale in France was established in 1648, well over a century before, that the Accademia di San Luca in Rome was founded in 1571. That is almost 200 years before. Academic art culture came late to Britain. Part of this, of course, is due to the Protestant Revolution, which sort of banished historical art and hierarchies of genres and things like that. It took a long time for British art to recover. The Royal Academy every year would hold an exhibition, the Royal Academy exhibition, where members of the Royal Academy were allowed to display their work. Gainsborough's motivation for wanting to paint this is that it was intended, it would have been given to Mrs. Siddons after the fact, but she also was interested, as he was, in having it exhibited at the Royal Academy exhibitions. It was publicity for her, not really that she needed it that much, but it also showed Gainsborough's engagement with celebrity culture on a visual level. And someone looking at this very likely would have been interested in commissioning a work from Gainsborough of this particular type. I want to be shown in the same hat that Mrs. Siddons is wearing, or I want to wear have the same muff, fur muff in my portrait that Mrs. Siddons has. In other words, these things we do this today. Some actress or someone comes out with something. I remember when boys started wearing sideburns because of that 90210 thing, when all the guys were wearing sideburns. Nobody wore sideburns before that. It's a form of cultural emulation based on sort of popular cultural icons and things like that. So this is what's really at stake here. But 2 points more about this picture. One, again, has no reference to Mrs. Siddons' profession, what made her a celebrity in the first place. She's shown in a society portrait way. The second thing is that this is basically a commercial transaction. Both Siddons and Gainsborough know what they're getting. She's getting a portrait by an object like this would have cost probably 250 guineas. That's a lot of money, a pound, over 250 pounds. in the 18th century, late 18th century. It's a lot of money. So she's getting a major portrait of herself by one of the two leading artists working in London at the time. He is getting rights for reproduction, that is the engraving market, and he's also getting publicity by having the work shown at the Royal Academy exhibition. Here is another portrait of Mrs. Siddons by Gainsborough's great rival, Joshua Reynolds. Joshua Reynolds was an extremely different type of artist from Gainsborough. Reynolds did go to the continent, to Italy, to Holland, to Paris. He went everywhere looking at art. He was deeply interested in continental art theory. He was interested in Art Academy ideologies. He studied the sort of the rules of foundation of the Académie in Paris. He was familiar with the various Italian academies, and he was an honorary member of some of them. His greatest wish in all of his life was to be a history painter. But he understood that in Protestant London, this was a very difficult thing to be a history painter. But so within the genre of portraiture, he tried to make portraiture as close to historical representations in that hierarchy as he possibly could. The theatrical portrait, like this version of Mrs. Siddons that was painted by Reynolds, the theatrical portrait was almost an ideal way to do this, to elevate portraiture. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to raise portraiture from its status below history painting, trying to push the bottom of history painting, sort of to create what he himself called half-history pictures. The reason that theatrical portraiture is so amenable to this is because you can show actors and actresses in famous roles from Shakespeare and from other types of historical plays. In other words, that textual tradition on which the superiority of history painting was based. That is, it's the visualization of a textual literary type of source. So by combining these types of elements with the portrait of the actor or the actress, you're able to sort of elevate portraiture beyond kind of the society level that we see here towards something more ideologically and academically serious. And that's what Reynolds was all about. Reynolds was the founding president of the Royal Academy of Art. This goes usually by the initials PRA. President of the Royal Academy. If you were just a mere Royal Academician, you had the letters RA after your name. When your works were exhibited at the salons, these initials were put after them, and this was another form of creating hierarchy and marketing. You know, people who were culturally insecure, like so many of these nouveau riche people wanting art to give them social status, they look at the initials and they say, oh, well, he's an RA, we have to have him. Rather than that associate of the Royal Academy who's this lowly creature that we don't want. Anyway, as George III appointed Reynolds as the initial president of the Royal Academy, but the thing that's ironic about that is that George III detested Reynolds. He thought he was a puffed up, sort of arrogant, social climbing nonentity. But he also realized, George III did, that Reynolds was by far the artist best suited to this task, both in terms of his professional training and in terms of his ideological and academic biases. Anyway, the picture that I'm showing here is Sarah Kimball Siddons as the Tragic Muse, painted in the same year as Gainsborough's version, and both of them exhibited at the same Royal Academy exhibition in the same room, although they unfortunately were not side by side. The Gainsborough is still in the National Gallery in London. This work is in the Huntington Museum in San Marino, California, so along with The Blue Boy by Gainsborough and a lot of other, Pinky by Lawrence, a lot of other famous British pictures. Anyway, Sarah Siddons as the Tragic Muse is the type of portrait, that theatrical portrait, that Reynolds saw as an opportunity to elevate the genre itself. He worked in this picture and in many others, we'll see one example coming up in just a moment, in a style that he himself called the grand manner. Not all Reynolds portraits, and as a matter of fact, not even the majority of Reynolds portraits, there are over 3,000 of them, are in the grand manner. But those that are in the grand manner show Reynolds' sort of ideological and academic aspirations at their finest. The tragic muse in mythology, her name is Melpomene. She's one of the 9 muses that hangs out on Mount Parnassus with the god Apollo, who's sort of the god of culture and poetry, in addition to a few other things as well. Reynolds, and one of the reasons we know so much about this stuff is that he kept a studio book. So when you went to Reynolds' studio for your sitting, there would usually be 3 of these where they would work on the head, and then the rest of it would be painted when you're not there. Anyway, Reynolds' studio book tells us just about all of his visitors who came to just watch him paint, who came to commission works, who was there for a sitting, how much they paid, down payments. This is all there. And most of it is still preserved in the British Museum, which is a fortunate thing. He describes the day when Sarah Siddons walked into his studio. This had all been prearranged, of course, by letter. She walked into his studio and he took one look at her. He had arranged a kind of a throne-like chair for her to sit in, and he looked at her and he says, now whether he's telling the truth or not is another issue, but he says, "Oh, great Melpomene, ascend your throne as the undisputed goddess of tragic poetry," and all that. In other words, Melpomene, do your thing. He says that she climbed up the dais. It's here camouflaged by clouds. This is happening in some sort of imaginary space in heaven, or on Mount Olympus or someplace like that. Anyway, he says, "Assume your throne," and she did, and he says she naturally fell into this attitude. This is how she disposed herself, just effortlessly. Now, anyone who's ever even sat for a photographic portrait knows that that's crap. It doesn't work that way. But this is the fiction that Reynolds creates surrounding the portrait. Melpomene, as the muse of tragedy, has a couple of friends who identify her. She's sitting here on her throne in this kind of pensive, inspired attitude, waiting for the muse to strike her to do some great role. There are 2 figures, male figures, behind her throne. This one is holding a chalice, and this one is holding a dagger. These are the 2 personifications in tragedy of plot devices that move the story forward. They represent open and secret murder. And of course, Macbeth, they're all murders, all these things. Anyway, the dagger, of course, is open murder because you confront the person and you do this. The chalice contains poison, and that's secret murder, which also is a major plot device in these types of tragedies. It's very interesting that Reynolds is one of the few and first 18th century artists who actually took Michelangelo seriously. Michelangelo was despised by academic art because he was too original, too inventive, too much of a genius. They said, yes, he's a genius, but you don't want to study him because it'll corrupt your style and all of that. Reynolds, when he saw the Sistine Chapel and he saw these sibyls on the Sistine Chapel ceiling flanked by these male figures of this type, he made sketches of them, and he sort of incorporated them here into this sort of theatrical context. Mrs. Siddons is a tragic muse, then, is a really glorious example of the grand manner that Reynolds himself claimed that he was trying to invent, which made portraits, but then combined notions and ideas from historical painting to create these grand manner half-history paintings that he loves so much. One other aspect before we move on from this picture is that when Reynolds became president of the Royal Academy in 1768, he initiated a series of presidential lectures which were meant for the membership of the Royal Academy. There were I think 40-something of them in the beginning. It goes up into the 60s. The amount is pretty much frozen. Somebody has to die before they have a new election for somebody to come in. Not the Supreme Court. Anyway, he initiated a series of presidential lectures. These happened irregularly, and I've got the dates for you here, from 1769 to 1790. They don't happen every year. There were 14 of them altogether. And as a body, they're called the Discourses on Art. These public lectures, again, he would be working from a kind of an outline or some sort of half-prepared text. They were, of course, edited and gussied up eventually for publication. The Discourses on Art, which is what this body of art theory is by far the most important, even today, the most important single body of artistic aesthetic theory in the English language. These were widely influential not only in England but especially in America. And American 19th century painting, especially in the first half of it, is actually absolutely inconceivable without Reynolds' Discourses. You can still read them to advantage. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting observation that tells us a lot about the way people thought about art and how Reynolds responded to the market in England, privileging portraiture over history painting. In other words, they're deeply revealing. After Gainsborough died, they had always been rivals, and Reynolds didn't have a lot of respect for Gainsborough personally. But once Gainsborough died, there's second to the last discourse praises Gainsborough effusively. This tells us a little bit about Reynolds as an operator. The level of sincerity sometimes has to be questioned. But the importance of the discourses in the history of English language art theory, it really can't be exaggerated. I'd like to show you one more picture by Reynolds in the grand manner that introduces yet another subgenre in British portrait painting, that is the military portrait. In the 18th century, the British fought a series of dynastic wars with the French. War of Spanish Succession in the first decade of the 18th century, War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, which in America we call the French and Indian Wars. And then the American War for Independence, in which the French came to the aid of the colonists and all of that, and yet another conflict with the British. These wars, of course, produce heroes, generals, admirals, etc., and there's a public demand for their portraits, because the engraving market, where sort of lower middle class people, they can afford to pay 4 shillings for a print, where they can never afford to pay 250 pounds for an oil on canvas painting. So this helps expand the market. These types of military prints in particular were put into cheap frames, and they appear in schools for young boys to look at. Look at the great hero, and we'll see one more example besides this guy a little bit later. Anyway, military portraiture then, exclusively male, but also it's a tribute to the force of British arms, to the spreading and glorification of the empire. In other words, a lot of British and especially English national identity is tied up in these types of military portraits, the way that Colonel Gordon's portrait of himself in half Scottish attire says a lot about Scottish national identity after Scotland had definitively lost its independence, really forever, it looks like. This picture is a portrait of Lord Heathfield, who's governor of Gibraltar, painted in 1787. Gibraltar, as you may know, is a little tiny rocky promontory on the southern coast of Spain, near the point where you enter the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic, and it had been wrestled from Spain in one of those dynastic wars early in the 18th century. It's one of the few remaining British colonies or British possessions outside of the British Isles. The British still own Gibraltar and still run it as a major naval base for the British Mediterranean Fleet. During the American War for Independence that was concluded by treaty in 1783, the French and the Spanish put Gibraltar under siege. This is known as the Great Siege of Gibraltar. Began in 1779 and only ended with the peace treaty in 1783. The Spanish in particular had been desperate to get Gibraltar back ever since they had to cede it to England back in 1714. And this was, of course, a failed attempt. Heathfield, of course, as the commander of the British forces at Gibraltar, who resisted this siege for all 3.5 years, became a national hero. And we see him here in the portrait by Reynolds, done in the grand manner. Gibraltar, of course, is a big mountain, sort of a big rock. If you've ever seen those insurance commercials from Hartford, the Rock of Gibraltar is like floating in the water. If you've never seen it, don't worry about it. But it's solid as the Rock of Gibraltar, which has a lot of sort of nationalistic meaning in addition to the thing being a fortified mountain. You can see one of the cannon here that's pointed downwards. As the Spanish and the French are trying to come up the mountain. It's hard to attack. They're trying to come up the mountain, sort of they're firing down at them. There's the smoke of battle all around Heathfield's. It sort of throws them into silhouette in this very dramatic type of way. You see more cannon in the background, but he's the only, and so there are a few soldiers just adumbrated over here, but he's basically the sole protagonist of the actual image. He's holding a large ceremonial key in his hand. And this is sort of an interesting twist on the grand manner as Reynolds practiced it. The key, of course, is the key of the fortress of Gibraltar. It shows that he's got, look how firmly this wrapped around his hand. It's not, he's got it, it's not going anywhere. But beyond that, it has an allusion to traditional Christian art with St. Peter, who holds the keys to the kingdom. Remember when we talked about Perugino's, Christ giving the keys to St. Peter in the Sistine Chapel back at the beginning of the semester. The key, of course, becomes the symbol of entry into heaven. Here, it's sort of been transmogrified into the symbol of Gibraltar, firmly in British possession. So this allusion to St. Peter, remember when we talked about the Dome of St. Peter's, this sort of large mosaic script around the bottom of it says, in English from the Latin translation, I am Peter, and upon this rock, rock of Gibraltar, upon this rock I shall build my church, that is my fort, and all the fury of hell, that is Spain and France, shall not prevail against it. So by taking this very widely identified traditional Christian subject and then nationalizing it into a secular British military context, that's how the grand manner works. That is, you take the commission that you're working on, and then you try to think of ways to make it sort of coordinate with traditional types of history paintings without actually, sort of being too obvious about it, because again, the market in a Protestant country doesn't tolerate that kind of activity. Okay. And I want to talk about one more of these military images that is probably the most famous of them all. It's by an artist named Benjamin West, who was a friend of Reynolds. Reynolds, when this young American, he's from Pennsylvania, he was a Quaker, lived in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia. In the American colonies back in the 1760s, there just artistically wasn't much going on. There were a couple wealthy Philadelphians who had been on the Grand Tour, who had brought back a few copies, some of them decent, but none of them great, of famous paintings from the European tradition. But other than these copies and engravings with no color, after historical and old masterworks of art, this was really all that West had to sort of base his artistic practice on. But clearly he was talented. And local Philadelphia wealthy people said, okay, this is an artist who's worth helping. So they got together, they pooled their resources, and they sent him to Europe, first to Rome, and then he went to England. The idea was, of course, that he would go to Rome, go to England, Paris, just do an artistic type of grand tour. He would learn all the lessons that he could learn there, and then he would come home to Philadelphia, bringing copies of works he had made in Europe as sort of payment for this stipend that he had received from these various rich people, and then he would become the great artist of Philadelphia. Well, in point of fact, like any sensible artist, at the time he got over there, you spent the money, he sent back a couple of copies, but he stayed. He never came back to Philadelphia. He settled in London in the early 1760s and became one of the leading painters in the British tradition. Benjamin West then, as this sort of American colonial Quaker, getting to Rome and then getting to England and establishing himself as an artist of the first rank, although Reynolds helped him tremendously early on, this must really have rankled Reynolds because West was so successful. And although West did paint portraits the way that Reynolds did, what West was best known for was history paintings. He became the only prominent history painter in latter 18th century England. West died in 1820. He succeeded Reynolds as president of the Royal Academy. I mean, this is a major, major artist. And George III, surprisingly, adored West. George III never did get over the loss of the American colonies to independence that was settled in the treaty that ended the war in 1783. He was constantly railing against the lost colonies, my empire, all that kind of stuff. West never made it ambivalent about where his loyalties lay. He understood and appreciated the colonial complaints against British government, no taxation without representation, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why George III respected him so much. Now, West did paint some religious pictures for certain kinds of English institutions where this could be tolerated. But generally speaking, his contribution to history painting was in contemporary or near contemporary history. And that's what we're looking at here. This is by far his most famous work. This is called The Death of General Wolfe, and it dates 1771. It commemorates the death of General Wolfe, who was the commander of the British forces during the 7 Years' War. Again, this is another one of those dynastic type of wars that I was talking about between the French and the English, among others. In 1759, when this picture is set, a great battle was fought at the Canadian city of Quebec. Quebec, before the 7 Years' War, had been a French colony. Canada was largely controlled by the French, and the English, of course, had the seaboard, the seaboard of the Atlantic, and from Maine to Georgia, that we think of now as American territory. Anyway, the Battle of Quebec, both commanding generals, the French general and the British general, were killed in the battle. But the British won the Battle of Quebec. The French were expelled from Canada, and Canada became this large and very important part of the British Empire. You see in the background the city of Quebec, shrouded in smoke. You see the Campanile, the bell tower of the cathedral. It's a Catholic town, of course, still is, sticking up out of the smoke. And then this is very hard to see, but zoom in on your computer, you can see it quite clearly. Right here, there is a man in a white uniform on a horse who's going like this. This is the Marquis de Montcalm, who was the commander of the French forces, who was killed in the battle as well. And it's said that he and Wolfe died within 3 minutes of one another. I don't know how they know that, but apparently they do. Anyway, Quebec on the far left, you see the St. Lawrence River with the British, the siege fleet of the British here, sort of camped out in the river itself. The area around, between the river and the city is called the Plains of Abraham, and that's where the battle actually took place. In point of fact, the whole thing was over in about 25 minutes, and the French were routed, but unfortunately General Wolfe did catch a bullet and died. Two really important things about this picture that mark it as a sort of a new departure for this kind of representation. One of them is the fact that the figures are shown in contemporary clothing, that is, in their military uniforms. Now, this isn't a portrait like Heathfield, where you'd expect him to be in his military uniform. This is a history painting. It commemorates the great victory, a battle in which a general is killed. Traditionally, and Reynolds argued with West about this when the painting was first conceived. Reynolds said, you can't do that. You can't show them in their uniforms because that marks them as being of a particular time, in a particular place, at a particular moment. Classical art, art that endures, is wearing drapery, like Roman drapery and stuff like that, the way history painting had been done really time out of mind. West listened to the advice and actually made a couple of sketches with the figures in these sort of ancient toga-like draperies, and he thought ultimately that it looked ridiculous. So he decided to go against Reynolds' advice and paint them in their contemporary clothing. When Reynolds saw the final product, Reynolds says, West, you were right. This is the way to do this. This completely changes the way that contemporary history, and not just England or Britain, this is true in France, as we will see, true everywhere. These kinds of scenes of contemporary or near contemporary history lost the togas forever, and they started being portrayed in contemporary clothing. This has been aptly called the revolution in history painting. That is, where history painting becomes more authentic, more specific, in other words, more research and historically oriented. Before, it was a more generic type of appeal to the ages type of thing. Here you actually have sort of the origins of 19th century historical revivalism, where people were in their clothing, in their contemporary clothing and all of that. You see General Wolfe here sort of fainting as he's about to die. He's surrounded by his various adjutants. We see a Mohawk warrior here. The Mohawk tribe were allies of the British against the French in this particular war. Other figures all sort of looking on. Look at how he blocks the figures out compositionally. This helps to increase the drama of what's happening in the center group. You've got these figures here who look almost like a parenthesis that close the composition to the right. Over here, this figure, there's no reason why he has to be in this attitude in this one either, but it helps this parenthetical over here to the left. So it sort of the composition kind of closes in on this central group here. This huge standard that the ensign here behind General Wolfe is holding, of course, comes from the ultimate compositional source. West understood what Reynolds was talking about with the Grand Manner because he deploys it here, again in a very different way. His compositional and thematic source for this was a deposition from the cross by the painter Antony van Dyck, who we looked at a while back. A major religious painter and portraitist in the English tradition. The standard then takes the place of the cross. And if you look at General Wolfe's body here, the way it's depicted, and the figures around it, it's almost like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and John the Evangelist sort of helping Christ's body come down from the cross. And if you see the Van Dyck original, I'm not taking time to show that to you, you can find it. Excuse me, you can find it online. It's clearly the compositional source for it. So here, a continental picture by a papist, Catholic artist, Van Dyck, has been completely, the composition has remained intact, but the entire context has been completely altered. This is exactly the kind of thing that Reynolds was arguing in the discourses for about the Grand Manner. I'd now like to move from 18th century England to 18th century France. In particular, to talk about not only the French Revolution, which broke out in 1789, but also to talk about, neoclassicism and its development. Now remember, the last time we were in France, we were talking about the Rococo. Artists like Watteau, Boucher, Fragonard, and that kind of sort of gayer, more free-spirited, looser, in many ways feminized type of art, not only in terms of subject, but also in terms of patronage. And how by the 1760s and early 1770s, many people in France were beginning to think that French military and economic decay, that is, the British kept kicking their ass in wars, and their industries were competing with the French very successfully. Many people saw this as a form of national decline that had been encouraged by the feminization of French culture. You only had to think of the court of Louis XV with the royal mistresses like Pompadour and these others where the king just wanted to hunt and they ran the government and all this kind of stuff. This was basically a crisis in the monarchy that really came into focus by the reign of Louis XVI. Who became king in 1774. This is Marie Antoinette. They both went to the guillotine during the Revolution. Neoclassicism, then, is part of a culture that not only wants to go against the Rococo, sort of an anti-Rococo bias, but they also saw neoclassicism as regenerative. Neoclassicism means exactly that, new classicism. They wanted to turn art away from these sort of mythologie galante that I talked about before, these sort of eroticized scenes, genre paintings of kind of frivolity and upper class life and all of that, towards a more serious seriousness of purpose. The great French philosophe Denis Diderot said that art's function in society is to make virtue attractive and vice odious. Virtue attractive and vice odious. In other words, the decorative effects of the Rococo needed to be replaced by the didactic imperative of art's main function, which is to educate people in morality and patriotism, loyalty to family, etc. So neoclassicism is not just a style, it is that, but it's also an ideological imperative meant to sort of resuscitate French art and bring it back to the seriousness of purpose that it had enjoyed back in the 17th century with artists like Poussin, who we talked about a while back. The leader of this neoclassical idea in France was Jacques-Louis David, the leading painter of the latter part of the 18th and the first couple of decades of the 19th century. He was a champion in art of an idea that is called the exemplum virtutis, that is the virtuous example. This gets back to what I just said about Diderot. That is that art's role in society is didactic. It teaches us something. It doesn't merely delight the senses. The picture that I'm showing you now is not only the result of David's 5-year period of study in Rome at the French Academy there, but it also has all of this kind of heroic didacticism that he saw as basically the antidote to the Rococo, and it launches a whole new direction in French art. The picture is one of the great warhorses of art history. I mean, many modernist surveys used to start with this picture, though I think that's a bit exaggerated. But anyway, the title of the picture is The Oath of the Horatii, and it dates 1784. When David was at the French Academy in Rome in the late 1770s, he came back in 1781, and when he decided to got this commission for a picture for the royal collection, he packed up his wife, his 2 little boys, and one of his students, and he went back to Rome. He said a painting of this seriousness of purpose could only be painted in Rome. It couldn't be painted in Paris because of Parisian frivolity. I mean, he basically just wanted to go back to Rome. It was cheaper to work there. But anyway, the Oath of the Horatii then was painted in Rome, and then he sent it back to the Royal Academy Salon, that is the big picture exhibition. This is the French version of the Royal Academy exhibition from the English Royal Academy that happened on an annual basis. In France, these salons are every other year. They're biannual. He sent it back, painted in 1784, exhibited in Rome. Even the Pope came from the Vatican to look at the picture. I mean, this was an important picture. Pompeo Battoni, who at the time was a very old man, remember Colonel Gordon and Diana and Cupid, Battoni said, please, you need to stay in Rome, settle yourself here, you can be my successor as the #1 painter and all of that. But David, for many skanky aspects of his personality, David was a Frenchman. And he appreciated what Rome had taught him and what Rome had given him, but he wanted to make his career back in France. So he went back and he sent the picture from Rome, and it was exhibited at the Salon of 1785. This salon was particularly controversial because it marked really the beginning of this completely new exemplum virtutis neoclassical didactic direction in French painting. The story of the Oath of the Horatii comes from ancient Roman history, back in the early days of Rome, the 6th century of before the Common Era. It's about 2 families, 2 major Roman families, the Horatii, I'm using the Italian pretension, the Horatii versus the Curatii. What was going on here is that the Curatii were plotting the overthrow of the Roman Republic so that they could then reestablish a monarchy. Rome had, in its very earliest days, had been a monarchy. Then for 5.5 centuries it was a republic, and then it became an empire with emperors. It's a long history. In other words, the Curatii wanted to undermine the government and establish a different form of government in which we assume that they would have been prominent types of figures. The Horatii are the heroes of the story. They are the ones who want to serve the Republic and to save the status quo. In other words, they are the patriots. They want to keep this intact. Rather than plunging Rome into civil war, it was decided between Daddy Horatius, who you see in the middle here, and Daddy Curacius, who is off stage somewhere, each of whom had 3 sons, that the 3 sons would battle one another, and whoever was left standing would get their way. This is to avoid bloodbath of a Roman civil war. So the three brothers of the Horatii versus the three brothers of the Curiatii met, they fought, and all were killed except one Horatius. He comes back, the Republic is saved, the Curiatii are dead and driven into exile, and all's right with the Republican world. This is the exemplum virtutis. It is the virtuous example. This kind of heroic idea, which puts aside personal, familial pride and personal concerns for the greater good of the state. This is basically what the exemplum virtutis and this type of neoclassicism are all about. In 1785, no one could predict that in 1789, just 4 years later, that the monarchy itself would be under threat and that France would be very soon plunged into a revolutionary civil war. After 1789, people looking back at the oath of the Horatii by David, including David himself, began to see this as a kind of a call to arms for fight for the republic rather than the monarchy. But the important point to remember here is that this picture was commissioned by the king, by the king's government. It went into the royal collection. And the whole idea that any form of monarchy could be, evil or anything like that had never occurred to David in 1785 or to anybody else. In 1785, the Horatii were patriots supporting the government and supporting the state rather than revolutionaries wanting to overturn the republic and overturn monarchies and return to monarchical control or republican control and all of that. So time here, date, is incredibly important. If this picture had been painted in 1789, it would have a completely different political valence. But in 1785, this is still about French patriotism, support for the monarchy, and all that kind of thing. Stylistically, this picture is revolutionary. Much more so, really, even than Benjamin West's clothing sartorial revolution back in the early 1770s. The setting is extremely spare. You have the architectural setting is just a three-arched arcade, very plain, no adornment, all that Rococo fruff and frou-frou and all that sort of expunged from the composition. It is a baseless Doric order of architecture, which is the most primitive and the most masculine of all the ancient orders. The male figures, the three Horatii and their father holding up their swords in this oath-taking, their die for the republic, or all that. Look at their anatomy. Zoom in on their legs and on their arms. Everything is meticulously described in a naturalistic way. This is because of their academic training, David's academic training in the Académie Royale. You drew after the posed male nude model over and over and over until you had absolutely mastered anatomy and correct drawing of the male form. Now, look over at the females. Look at the one on the left in the white, whose arm is just drooping like overcooked linguine. They're boneless. You can't even imagine. Can you imagine her raising her left hand to ask a question? I mean, it's absolutely impossible. The female body is ungoverned by the Academy. You could do anything, artists could do anything they liked with the female body as long as it was decorative and elegant and created sinewy lines. In other words, the female body in pictures like this is treated almost like a still life. That is, the elements of it are manipulated for aesthetic effect rather than naturalistic representation. Also, in a lot of Rococo art, as we saw, the female figure is in the center of the composition and the males are sort of arrayed around her, looking at her. She is the active component. Neoclassicism banishes women to where they belonged, over here on the margins, weeping over their own personal ideas, completely incapable of understanding the real importance of what's going on here. They're thinking only of their concerns, personal, familial concerns. For instance, the woman in white over here on the right, her name is Horatia. The Romans had three names and they just keep interchanging them. Anyway, she is Horatia. She is the sister of the three warriors. She was engaged to one of the Curiatii brothers who was killed in the combat. When her brother was coming back victorious, he's the only one of the six left standing, he saw her weeping for her dead lover. He was so outraged at her inability to understand the finer things of patriotism and all that he took out his sword and he killed her. he was put on trial, his father was the judge, and he was acquitted. So this tells us everything we need to know about gender politics and the classicist. This is a male world. No fervor like the Reform. That is, we had all that women's stuff back in the Rococo and the court of Louis XV and all that. We're not doing that anymore. We're doing something else. So his killing her then becomes a type of virtue because it's about sacrifice of family and individuality in favor of the state. I'll introduce this painting and then I'll conclude with it in the beginning next time. This picture is called The Dead Marat, and it was painted in 1793. A lot happened historically, and that's what I'll give you now before I talk about the picture specifically next time. In 1789, as I mentioned, the revolution broke out in France. The reason why is because the French government was bankrupt. By 1788. They couldn't pay their bills, they couldn't even retire the interest on their debt with national income. Income was pledged like 20 years in advance. I mean, it was a financially chaotic situation. One of the reasons why is that neither the church nor the aristocracy paid any tax. The tax burden fell completely on what was called the Third Estate. The clergy being the first estate, the aristocracy being the second estate, everybody else being the third estate. So these tax privileges of the wealthiest people in French society and the single wealthiest institution in French society, of course, put an enormous tax burden on average middle class and lower class people. This had gotten to the point with bad harvests and defeats in wars and all the money that the French spent, helping the Americans achieve independence from Britain and all of that, had basically bankrupted the state. The only thing that was to be done, that could be done, was that the tax base had to somehow be expanded. And so they summoned representatives of all three estates to Versailles to discuss ways that they could basically deal with this, very bad financial crisis. Well, of course, neither the church nor the aristocracy are willing to give up their, tax exemptions and all that kind of stuff. So the Third Estate said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. The tradition is that these groups of people voted by estate. This ensured that the upper class could always outvote the lower class. Estate 1, Estate 2, Estate 3. So it was a 2-to-1. It's like one of these Supreme Court things. It's 2-to-1, every decision and all of that. Finally, in frustration, when the king couldn't get his way, he tried to close down all of the discussions and arrest some of the members from the Third Estate who were agitating for a constitution and other major reforms that the king was not willing to make. This is what caused the revolution. The Third Estate resisted. On July 14th, which is still the national holiday in France, they stormed the Bastille prison in downtown Paris. Thinking that they would liberate prisoners and find a bunch of guns and all that. In point of fact, they found almost nothing except 5 or 6 insane people and 3 or 4 old rusty swords and all of that. But it became this national symbol of the fall of the Bastille. This is when the violent stage of the revolution happened. By 1792, the monarchy had been established. It increasingly radicalizes as it moves along. By 1792, the monarchy had been abolished. Massacres had broken out all over the country. Royalists, people were fleeing the country as fast as they could get away. Those who didn't were being caught and unpleasant things happening to them. We have absolutely no indication of David's political sympathies before the revolution. But once the revolution broke out, and certainly by 1790, he had become a major force in left-wing politics. He joined the Jacobin Party, again, not to be confused with the Jacobites, that's the Scottish folks back in the middle of the century, Jacobins, who were the most radical of the various revolutionary groups, all vying for power in this extremely unstable political situation. One of the leaders of the Jacobins was a man named Jean-Paul Marat, who had been a physician but had not been able to secure a royal appointment, so he was a disappointed aspirant for higher royal favor. During the Revolution, he became a Jacobin journalist. He published a paper called The Friend of the People. Yeah, right. the friend of the people. And he would denounce royalist plots and all this. And if you read about it in The Friend of the People, that somebody was a counter-revolutionary, the next day you read about them being arrested, and then a week later about them being executed after a kangaroo court type of trial. Marat was a venomous, hideous type of individual. He used his paper to settle his debts. That is, if he owed somebody money, he simply denounced them as a royalist. They were arrested, and then the debt kind of just went away, along with the head of the person who was being accused. He was assassinated in his bathtub. And the reason why he's in a bathtub in David's picture is because he had a terrible skin condition, a sort of an ulcerative form of psoriasis that required him to spend most of his day in a medicinal bath just to soothe the sores. I mean, he's a monstrous person, and then he has this kind of monstrous type of disease. You see that he's got a desk pulled over the top of the tub in the picture, and he has various writing paraphernalia and documents here with it. I'll conclude here because I want to talk about these documents in a little bit more detail and the iconography of the picture. Please, for next time, read the next reading assignment, which is an article by Nina Gelbart called The Blonding of Charlotte Corday. Charlotte Corday was the woman who stabbed him to death in the bathtub. And the fact that she's not present in this supposedly historical type of scene is extremely compelling, and I want to talk about gender problems in the Revolution, but also the iconography of death, which is sort of reinvented during the Revolutionary decade.